Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into something I think is on a lot of people's minds, the mental well-being of Gen Z, those born after 1995 or so.
Yeah, it's a big topic.
It really is. And we're going to be exploring some really compelling ideas, mainly drawn from Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation.
A really important book, I think.
Absolutely. So, our mission today is to kind of pull out the key insights from his work, try and understand why we might be seeing these increases in anxiety and depression in young people, and maybe touch on some potential ways forward.
Right. Keeping it clear, trying not to get bogged down in, too much detail, but hitting the main points.
Exactly. For everyone listening, whether you're a parent, an educator, maybe just curious about these generational shifts, this is for you.
And Haidt really focuses on two big narratives, two kind of major plot lines that he argues have fundamentally rewired childhood.
Okay, what are those?
Well, first, there's the massive, almost radical change brought by digital technology. We all feel that, right? And second, there's this other trend, often really well-intentioned, towards overprotecting kids in the physical world, shielding them from risk.
Interesting. So maybe preventing them from having certain experiences.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Leading to maybe some unintended negative effects. So we need to dig into both of those.
Okay, let's do that. Where should we start? Maybe with the evidence, the mental health data itself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because Haidt really grounds his argument there. He shows this graph, figure 1.1 in the book,
Right.
looking at major depressive episodes among U.S. teenagers. And what just leaps out is this really sharp upward turn starting bang, right around the early 2010s.
It's that hockey stick shape you hear about.
Exactly. It's not a slow, gradual climb.
Okay.
It's sudden. It's significant. That's the key thing for listeners to grasp the timing of it.
And it wasn't just one group, right? It hit broadly.
That's right. The data shows it happening across different races, different social classes. Now, girls saw a bigger absolute increase in depression rates. But the relative increase, the percentage jump from the baseline around 2010, was actually pretty similar for both boys and girls, around 150% increase.
Wow, 150%. That's huge.
It's dramatic, and it affects both young men and young women significantly.
And it's really important to stress this spike mostly happened before COVID-19 hit.
Absolutely crucial point. The pandemic definitely added pressure, no doubt, but this trend was well underway years before 2020.
Which leads right to Haidt's central question. What on earth happened in the early 2010s? What could have caused such a widespread and sudden downturn?
Exactly the question. So let's tackle that first big storyline, technology, what Haidt calls the Great Rewiring.
The Great Rewiring. Okay.
Because those years, roughly 2009 to 2012, seem pivotal. You had this convergence of several really powerful tech changes happening almost simultaneously.
Like what?
Well, first, high-speed broadband internet had been spreading through the 2000s, becoming much more common.
Right, setting the stage.
Then, the iPhone launched in 2007. That was the game changer, really bringing the internet into our pockets, making it mobile and constant.
Yeah, that changed everything.
And then, right around 2009, you get the arrival of what Haidt terms hyper-viralized social media.
Hyper-viralized. What does that mean exactly? How is it different?
Well, think about the introduction of the like button on Facebook and the retweet button on Twitter, both around 2009.
Ah, okay, those little buttons.
Seemingly small, right?
Ah.
But they fundamentally changed the dynamic. Before that, social media was mostly about keeping up with friends you already knew. It didn't have these instant public performance metrics built in.
So it became less about just connecting and more about performing, getting likes.
Exactly. It introduced this constant feedback loop, this public evaluation. Less private chat, more public broadcast in comparison. That's a key insight, this shift in how people interacted online.
Right. Performing for an audience, even if it's just your friends. Okay, so that was one wave. But wasn't there another tech shift around then too, more visual?
Absolutely. That came just slightly later, and it seems to have had a particularly strong impact on girls.
Yeah.
We're talking about the rise of image-based social media.
Okay.
This was really driven by two things.
Oh.
First, smartphones started getting front-facing cameras. The iPhone 4 in June 2010 was a big one. Samsung followed. Suddenly, taking selfies was easy.
The selfie camera, yeah. Seems obvious now, but that was huge.
It really was. And then Instagram launched, initially just for smartphones, and it exploded. Facebook bought it in 2012, which just amplified its reach massively.
And Instagram was all about the visuals, the curated image.
Precisely. It fostered this culture of sharing highly polished, often idealized images of yourself in your life. So by 2012, you have Many teens, especially girls, feeling this intense pressure. Everyone's getting a smartphone, everyone's seemingly on Instagram.
And everyone else looks like you're having a perfect life online.
Exactly. Leading to this constant upward social comparison, particularly around appearance and experiences.
Mm.
The insight here is how visual platforms cranked up that comparison pressure.
So Haidt's argument is that Gen Z basically became unwilling test subjects in this completely new way of growing up.
That's the core idea. He uses this really striking analogy, comparing them to the first generation to grow up on Mars,
Wow.
meaning they grew up in an environment, this digitally saturated world that's fundamentally different from the face-to-face, real-world social environment that shaped human development for, well, basically forever.
That really puts it in perspective, the sheer novelty of it.
It does. But it wasn't just the technology, remember? That's only half the story he tells.
Right, the second plot line. The decline of free play and this rise in overprotection.
Exactly. The sense that childhood itself became much more supervised, much less spontaneous.
This definitely feels true. I mean, anecdotally, it seems like kids just don't have the same kind of freedom to roam and play unsupervised as maybe previous generations did. What does the research show?
Haidt points to the decline really starting back in the 1980s, but then accelerating quite dramatically through the 1990s.
And why then? What was driving it?
He argues a big factor was rising parental fear, specifically fear of abduction by strangers. The term stranger danger really took off in books and media during that period.
Stranger danger, yeah. I remember that being everywhere. It created this narrative that unsupervised kids were constantly at risk.
It did. Even if the actual statistical risk hadn't dramatically changed, the perception of risk did. And that, in turn, shifted parenting norms quite profoundly. That's a key insight, the power of that fear narrative.
And it's happened even as families were changing, like more women entering the workforce. You'd think parents might have less time for supervision.
Paradoxically, no. Time use studies Haidt cites actually show that starting quite abruptly in the mid-1990s, both mothers and fathers began reporting spending more direct time interacting with their children.
Huh. More time, but maybe different kind of time.
Exactly. It seems it often translated into more supervised, structured activities rather than just letting kids be. More direct oversight.
Less independence, perhaps. Seems like it. And there's data supporting this shift in norms. He mentions a 2015 Pew Research report,
Okay.
where parents, on average, thought kids needed to be much older for unsupervised activities compared to what was common before. Things like believing a kid should be 10 just to play in their own front yard unsupervised.
10!
Wow, to stay home alone for an hour. And maybe the most striking, 14 to go to a public park alone.
14. That seems really high compared to, say, the 70s or 80s.
It's a dramatic shift. The takeaway is just how much our baseline expectations for childhood independence have changed in a relatively short span.
And Haidt connects this decline in outdoor, unsupervised time with the rise of indoor entertainment too, right? Like computers.
He does. As computers and video games became more engaging and accessible, they offered a very compelling alternative to playing outside, especially if outside felt less safe or less permitted.
So kids moved indoors. But what do they lose by missing out on all that free play? That's the crucial question. Haidt emphasizes just how fundamental play is. It's not optional. It's essential for development. He cites research on young mammals. If you deprive them of play, they show serious social and emotional problems later on.
So play isn't just fun, it's actually necessary work for development.
Exactly. He calls it the work of childhood. It's how young creatures, including humans, learn essential life skills in a relatively safe way. You learn by doing, by trying, by failing, by negotiating.
Like his analogy of kittens learning to hunt by play fighting.
Perfect example. They're practicing essential survival skills. Human kids do the same, learning motor skills, but also crucial social skills. How to cooperate, how to compete fairly, how to manage disagreements in games like tag or make-believe. It's experiential learning you can't just get from a book or screen.
And what about Peter Gray's point about play needing you to suppress dominance?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Gray argues that to play successfully, especially social play, kids have to learn to dial back their urge to dominate. They have to cooperate, take turns, compromise, otherwise the game falls apart.
So play actually teaches cooperation and social intelligence.
Directly, it builds the foundation for navigating complex social relationships later on. And Haidt contrasts this deeply embodied, real-time, synchronous nature of play.
With online interactions.
Right, which are often disembodied. Asynchronous, you post something, wait for a response, and often one-to-many, like posting to a feed. It's a very different kind of interaction.
He uses that analogy of experience blockers, doesn't he? Like giving babies videos about walking instead of letting them actually try to walk.
Exactly. It's a powerful image. Are we replacing essential real-world practice with passive digital consumption? That's the worry. Passive viewing versus active doing.
And it relates to those serve and return interactions, too.
Yes, that back and forth like a rally in tennis. It's fundamental for learning social timing, reading cues, attuning to another person in real time.
Which social media often doesn't allow for, being asynchronous.
Right, you miss the nuances, the immediate feedback, the nonverbal stuff. So even if you're connected online all the time, you might be missing out on developing those deep skills for face-to-face interaction, leading, ironically, to feeling less socially adept and potentially more isolated.
So putting it together, big tech changes pulling kids online, plus less opportunity or permission for real-world play, it creates a really different learning environment for Gen Z.
Hugely different. And Haidt brings in these ideas about how humans learn culture concepts like conformist bias and prestige bias from Joe Hendrick's work.
Okay, what are those?
Basically, conformist bias is our tendency to copy what most people around us are doing. It's usually a good shortcut to learning social norms. Prestige bias is our tendency to imitate people who seem successful or high status.
Makes sense. We learn by watching and copying, especially those we admire or who seem to know what they're doing.
These are deep-seated, evolved learning strategies. But Haidt argues social media platforms can kind of hijack them.
Yes.
Well, instead of learning primarily from your family, your local community, your peers in the playground, your attention gets pulled towards online influencers, celebrities, trends dictated by algorithms designed purely for engagement.
So the local culture gets drowned out by this global, often commercialized online culture.
That's the concern. And kids are also plunged into all sorts of adult topics and content online without the usual sequencing or context they'd get in the real world. This can really mess with identity formation, understanding relationships, their whole worldview.
Yeah, it's like skipping crucial developmental steps, just thrown into the deep end online.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And remember, adolescence is this incredibly sensitive period for brain development. That old saying, neurons that fire together wire
But
together.
practice makes permanent in the brain.
Pretty much. So if adolescents are spending hours and hours daily doing specific things online, constantly comparing, seeking validation, dealing with online conflict, those neural pathways get strengthened, potentially shaping their brains long term. The habits of youth can become hardwired.
And this links to stress too, right? You mentioned Lawrence Steinberg's work on the inverted U.
Yes. The idea is that a little bit of manageable acute stress, like figuring out a playground squabble or tackling a hard homework problem, is actually good for you. It builds resilience, coping skills.
The beneficial stress zone.
Right. But too much stress or chronic, unrelenting stress is bad. It's detrimental to mental and physical health.
And the worry is that the online world, combined with maybe fewer real-world coping skills learned through play, pushes kids into that harmful, chronic stress zone.
That's a major concern. Constant comparison, fear of missing out, online harassment. It can be a relentless barrage without the off switch, and maybe without the skills learned through real-world practice to handle it effectively.
It feels like they miss the small bumps that build resilience and instead hit these huge, overwhelming digital waves.
That's a good way to put it. And it also connects, Haidt suggests, to a loss of something else, traditional rites of passage.
Rites of passage, like coming-of-age ceremony.
Exactly. Historically, many cultures had clear rituals marking the transition from childhood to adulthood. Think Arnold van Gennep's phases.
Yeah.
Separation, transition, reincorporation.
Okay.
These rituals provided structure, guidance, social recognition. They helped adolescents understand their new roles and responsibilities as adults. They gave a map.
But we don't really have many of those clear markers anymore in, say, Western societies.
Largely, no. And Haidt argues the digital world has blurred the lines even further. It's less clear when you become an adult what that even means. This lack of clarity can contribute to feeling lost, aimless, stuck.
A kind of prolonged adolescence, maybe, without a clear path forward.
That's the idea, which brings us to Haidt's framework of the 4 foundational harms he sees resulting from this phone-based childhood.
Okay, the 4 harms. This sounds like the core of the impact. What's the first one?
First is social deprivation. Even though kids might be constantly connected online, Those connections often lack the depth and richness of face-to-face relationship.
So quantity over quality.
In a way, yes. They might be missing out on practicing crucial skills like reading nonverbal cues, managing conflict constructively in person, real-time empathy.
And he has data on this, showing increased loneliness despite connectivity.
Yeah, he points to figures showing high school seniors reporting fewer close friends and feeling more lonely, ironically, during the period when smartphone use exploded. So, more connection, but maybe less real connection.
That's quite the paradox. Okay, what's the second harm?
Sleep deprivation. This one's pretty straightforward. I think many parents see it. Smartphones in the bedroom, endless scrolling, FOMO. It pushes bedtimes later and eats into crucial sleep time.
And teens need more sleep than adults, right?
They do, typically 8 to 9 hours. The data he shows indicates a significant rise in teen sleep deprivation after 2012 or 2013. And lack of sleep messes with everything: mood, attention, learning, physical health.
Right, it's foundational. Okay, harm number 3.
Attention fragmentation. The constant pings, notifications, the lure of the device. It makes sustained focus incredibly difficult.
Like trying to read a book with someone constantly tapping you on the shoulder.
Exactly. It leads to that feeling William James described: confused, dazed, scatterbrained. And Haidt points out, app developers know this. They deliberately use techniques like variable ratio reinforcement.
Like slot machines.
Precisely. Unpredictable rewards that keep you checking, keep you hooked, constantly fragmenting your attention away from other things like schoolwork or just quiet reflection. It trains the brain for distraction.
That's worrying. Okay, and the fourth harm.
Addiction. This flows directly from the last point. These apps are designed, using behavioral psychology, to trigger dopamine release, creating cravings.
So it's not just a bad habit, it can be a genuine addiction.
For some, yes. He discusses withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, irritability, trouble sleeping, feeling low when usage is cut back. Similar to gambling addiction. He shares that story of Alexis.
Oh yeah, the girl who went to great lengths to get around parental controls for Instagram.
Exactly. It shows the powerful pull these platforms can have, overriding other considerations. It highlights the addictive potential.
So social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. That's a pretty heavy list.
It is. And Haidt argues these harms don't necessarily land equally on everyone. He discusses differences between girls and boys.
Right. He suggests girls have been hit harder, especially by social media. Why is that?
The reasoning is that online platforms, particularly visual ones like Instagram, tend to amplify pressures around appearance and social comparison, which often weigh more heavily on girls due to existing societal pressures.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
And the data reflects this. Sharper increases in anxiety, depression, self-harm, even hospitalizations for girls, coinciding with the rise of smartphones and social media in the early 2010s.
And didn't Facebook's own research kind of confirm this about Instagram?
It did. The leaked internal documents showed they were aware that Instagram made body image issues worse for a significant number of teen girls, and users themselves linked it to increased anxiety and depression.
Wow. And you mentioned emotions spreading through networks, like social contagion.
Yeah, drawing on work like Christakis and Fowler's study on happiness spreading in the Framingham Heart Study Network. Haidt suggests something similar might happen with distress, especially in dense online networks.
So anxiety or depression could potentially spread more easily among girls online.
It's a hypothesis, linked to the idea of sociogenic illness conditions influenced or spread by social factors. He mentions research on anxiety presenting with physical symptoms, which might be more common among girls under social stress. It suggests distress isn't just individual, it's relational.
Okay, so that's the argument for the disproportionate impact on girls. What about boys? Did they escape unscathed?
Not entirely, but the pattern looks different. While their rates of diagnosed mental illness also rose, Haidt points more towards a longer-term trend for boys: declining engagement in the real world.
Disengagement, how so?
Less involvement in school, work, maybe even family formation later on. And correspondingly, more time spent in the virtual world, especially intensive video gaming.
Trading the real world for the virtual one.
Perhaps. And linked to this, he shows data suggesting a rise in boys feeling their lives are meaningless or lack purpose. He connects it to broader societal issues facing males that others like Richard Reeves have written about. The virtual world might offer a compelling escape or sense of mastery that feels lacking elsewhere.
So for girls, maybe more internalizing issues amplified by social media comparison. For boys, perhaps more externalizing through disengagement and retreat into virtual worlds.
That seems to be the general thrust of his argument, yes. It's complex, obviously, but points to different vulnerabilities.
Okay. There was one more dimension you mentioned earlier, the spiritual dimension. How does the phone fit in there?
Yeah, this is a more philosophical point Haidt raises. He suggests that constant immersion in our phones might lead to a kind of spiritual degradation.
Spiritual degradation. What does he mean by that?
He draws on Durkheim's idea of the sacred versus the profane. The phone world is often profane, mundane, self-focused, sometimes crude. Constant immersion might blur our connection to the sacred shared values, collective rituals, experiences larger than ourselves.
Hmm. And it keeps us focused on ourselves.
It often does. Social media tends to activate the brain's default mode network, which is involved in self-reflection, social cognition, thinking about ourselves. Constant activation might hinder moments of self-transcendence.
Getting outside of our own heads.
Exactly. Feeling connected to something bigger, whether it's nature, community, a cause. The phone keeps pulling us back to the self, to comparison, to judgment.
And he links this to awe, especially in nature.
Yes. Experiences of awe, feeling wonder in the face of something vast and beautiful like nature, are powerful ways to induce that self-transcendence. They counter anxiety and self-focus. A phone-based life might mean fewer opportunities for real-world awe.
So the phone might be blocking not just real-world play, but also these deeper, potentially meaning-making experiences.
That's the implication. It might be subtly eroding our connection to things that provide deeper meaning and perspective beyond the everyday digital churn.
Okay. So pulling all these threads together, it's a powerful argument. This massive, rapid shift to a phone-based childhood happening right alongside this trend of increased real-world protection and decreased free play.
Creating a kind of perfect storm, Haidt argues, that fundamentally rewired the experience of growing up and contributed significantly to the mental health crisis we see in Gen Z.
Yeah. And for everyone listening, understanding these interconnected causes, the tech, the play deficit, the social dynamics, the brain impacts, seems really crucial if we want to figure out how to move forward.
Absolutely. Understanding the why is the essential first step towards informed choices, whether as individuals, families, schools, or society.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it definitely leaves us with some big questions. If this analysis is broadly correct, what are the long-term consequences for society if these trends just continue?
The sobering thought.
And maybe more practically, what can actually be done? What individual or collective actions might genuinely help foster healthier development for the kids coming up now and in the future?
Haidt himself proposes some pretty bold starting points in the book. 4 foundational reforms.
Right. Can you remind us what they are?
Sure. He suggests no smartphones before high school, no social media before age 16, making schools phone-free environments, and actively creating far more opportunities for unsupervised play and independence in the real world.
Those are definitely concrete ideas. Bold, like you said, but concrete. They certainly give us something specific to think about and discuss further.
Exactly. They're conversation starters for what needs to change.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful, a lot to process. Thank you for joining us on this important deep dive today.